Today, I'm extremely honored to be speaking with Dr. Steve Mason. Steve, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here. Thanks very much, Tim.
I'd like to start by giving a bio for Dr. Mason. It's pretty lengthy. Normally, I would say I'm just going to give a brief bio, but I'd like to do a full bio here, and I'm sure Dr. Mason could add to it when I'm done, but I'd like to everyone to listen to this. It's going to take probably 3 to 4 minutes, but the reason I'm wanting to do this is because I want people to realize who we're speaking with in terms of the level of background. Dr. Steve Mason, is a historian of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world, specifically focusing on the Roman rule, which is about 200 BCE to 400 CE, and with a focus on Roman Judea. He has extensively studied the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus and the Christian Jewish-Roman relations in that era, and he's authored and edited numerous books on Josephus, which I'll mention in a second. He earned his BA and MA in religious studies at McMaster University in Canada, which was a pioneer in the secular study of religion, combining early Judaism and Christian origins as one area, and focusing intently on the historical contextual interpretation of primary texts. He earned his PhD at Toronto's St. Michael's College, with his dissertation being on the works of Flavius Josephus. And during that time, he spent 1 year at Hebrew University of Jerusalem and another at the University of Tübingen, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, one of Germany's top universities, focusing on ancient Judaism and early Christianity. His PhD, again, was in the works of Flavius Josephus. This opened the door to much more intensive research related to Josephus and other topics. And after teaching 2 years at the Memorial University of Newfoundland, he spent his next, is it 22 years?
Yeah.
22 years at Toronto's York University, which is that's a long tenure there, shifting gradually from the Division of Humanities to the Department of History, and from teaching Christian origins and ancient Judaism to holding a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Greco-Roman cultural interaction. In 1995 to 96, he was the head of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies at the Pennsylvania State University, after which he returned to York University. In 2011, you took up the Kirby Lang Chair in New Testament in Aberdeen, Scotland, during the tenure of which you spent 1 year in Berlin with the Humboldt Research Prize. Am I saying that correctly?
That's correct, yeah.
And half a year in Groningen, Netherlands, as the first Dirk Smilde Visiting Fellow. See here. Going forward, since 2015, you've been the Distinguished Professor of Ancient Mediterranean Religions and Cultures in the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. That school, just for anyone who doesn't know, is, and I apologize for looking down here so much to reading through some notes, but the school is in the northern part of the Netherlands, not far from the northern border that touches the North Sea. And it's one of the top 100 large comprehensive research universities in the whole world. And Dr. Mason joined the university just 1 year after it celebrated its 400th anniversary. And the school has 3 libraries, and this is probably the most impressive thing about the school. The library at the city center has a Starbucks on its premises. Very nice. Dr. Mason is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and has a dual Canadian and British citizenship, and edits and contributes to the 16-volume Brill project called Flavius Josephus Translation and Commentary. He has an online database called the Project on Ancient Cultural Interaction. He's a member of the budding Flavian Literature Network, and his work on ancient interethnic relations and conflicts is also moving toward a research project on human rights, realism, and religion in antiquity. And I'll wrap up here 1 second with this. Your books include, and for anyone who's listening, see if you can see a theme here. A History of the Jewish War, Orientation to the History of Roman Judea, Flavius Josephus and Flavian Rome, Life of Josephus, Josephus and the New Testament, Early Christian Reader, Josephus, Judea and Christian Origins, Flavius Josephus, Translation and Commentary, Understanding Josephus, 7 Perspectives, Flavius Josephus on the Pharisees. And his books have been described by scholars as sophisticated, thorough, provocative, striking, original, engaging, wide-ranging, well-researched, carefully argued, meticulous, and valuable, wonderfully well-written, and skillfully synthesizing discussions ranging from archaeology and numismatics to chronology to political science and military theory. So in a nutshell, if this was karate, we would be talking about your 7 black belts. So I am definitely amazed and outgunned in every sense, but I'm very appreciative of your being here today.
Oh, thank you, Tim. As a former karateka, I very much like the metaphor and wish it were true in karate. But anyway,
Yeah.
there you go. You can only do certain things in life. But thank you. That you found the most generous reviews. It sounds like, which pleases me very much. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it was a pleasure just looking up your bio. Honestly, there's a lot there, and I'm sure that's probably not even the full story. I wanted to ask you, of course, number one, to just correct anything I misrepresented there, and also just to tell us a little bit more about yourself in your words.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I don't think I have anything to correct, except that it sounded to me more impressive than I thought it was in reality. But that's okay. I'll take it. Thank you. The project on realism and its ancient roots and international relations, it didn't get the grant that I was hoping for, so I'm not sure where that's going. But it's still something I'd like to do. I've also just submitted a book proposal with a colleague who does early Islam towards a new history of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic origins, based on a whole different way of looking at a different set of categories than we usually use. So that's pretty much the supplement. Don't know how much you want me to tell you of my story at this point, but I'll let you take the lead.
Sure. Could I ask before I do that, what, in terms of your bio for non-work stuff, what kind of hobbies do you have?
I am a not very good saxophone player. Sometimes call myself a saxophony, in that I do practice, but I don't have the technical skill that one associates with a saxophone. I did play at my sister's wedding because she's very generous, but that's pretty much my only real gig. But I love to practice. Other than that, working out in various ways. So the music, exercise, sleep, eat, work. But the nice thing about our kind of work, my kind of work, is that it's not really work. I mean, it's hard. It can be hard, especially some aspects of teaching and so on, the usual stuff. But it's not really work in the sense I've worked in the mine, or at a mine, above ground. I've worked in various laboring jobs, security work, where you have an actual boss, looking over your shoulder. Universities are heading that way, arguably, but they're nowhere near that yet. And so, there's still the life of the mind, where you get to think and write and research. And that's the most exciting stuff in the world, as long as we can preserve it. So, that's my life in a nutshell.
That's awesome.
And I have some great friends and wonderful children in Canada. So I'm very, whether or not one believes in God, I would say I'm blessed in some way. Blessed
Absolutely.
In the sense of happy, a fortunate person.
And how many children do you have?
I have two. I have a daughter who's a psychiatric nurse and a son who is a builder.
Awesome.
And they both are very creative and do amazing work. I don't know where they get their skills from. Certainly skipped my generation, but just wonderful, wonderful kids.
That's awesome. I will admit, I don't do anything with construction or working with my hands like that now, but I grew up in a wood shop. My dad was a wood shop teacher, and I spent 4 years later on as a custom cabinet maker. I do miss it. I miss being able to, physically build something and say, I built this. It's There's nothing like physical work, right? I mean, even if you're not building, I can't build anything, but even just pick and shovel work, I've missed it sometimes, because academic work, you go to sleep with it, you wake up with it, a problem in your head. Whereas when you're just shoveling a coal or something like that, or what spilled off a conveyor belt, you're done at the end of 8 hours and you're exhausted, but you feel great. And then you go do other stuff. So there's some advantages to that as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Look what I did.
Yeah. Especially when you can use some of that to create gifts for people or something that's long going like that. I wanted to ask just kind of a mini icebreaker. The Starbucks that you have there. Do you go there? And if you go there, what's your drink of choice?
Yeah, I've been there. I don't go often. It's been closed, of course, with COVID-19 for quite a long time now.
Okay.
But when I go, my drink of choice is a grande latte skim milk extra shot.
Nice. Very nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mine is very similar. Years ago, I was working at a job as a stockbroker, and they needed to hire more people. They chose not to, and instead asked everyone to work crazy overtime, unlimited. There was a Starbucks right next door, and I went there for the caffeine, but I didn't really like the taste of what I was getting. And as the people there became friends with me, they asked me about it, and I said, no, I don't really like it. And they said, well, we don't want you to not like it. Let's work on it till we find something you like. And they worked on something, and we eventually got to one that's very similar to yours. But it's addicting.
What's your drink?
Well, it's going to sound like I'm being too picky, but honestly, we tried every combination. This is mine. It's a grande latte, triple shot, 1 vanilla, 2 toffee nuts, whole milk at 180, meaning 180 degrees, which is pretty hot for some people. So whole milk at 180 with extra foam and whipped cream. That drink, if it's done right, is absolutely glorious.
Yeah, but it's like a whole week's meal, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Like several food groups in there.
It is. It is. Well, I wanted to ask, before I do want to get into your story, I wanted to ask a little bit about your classes, just real quickly. What kind of classes do you teach, and what are the subjects, and anything you want to add about that?
Yeah, I've taught all over the map. So a quick rundown from Memorial. As a new person, you get to teach everything. I taught world religions alone, and had to brush up quite a bit. Then I taught history of Christianity in Western civilization, things like that, but also as narrow and specific as the historical Jesus or things like that. That was early in my career. I haven't done that in a very long time. When I was a research professor at York, the research chair I had, I didn't really have to teach much. I was mainly researching, which accounts in some measure for the publication volume that many people don't have a chance to do. But I, in that case, taught seminars on Jewish, Christian, Roman relations. So these would be graduate seminars on aspects of Jewish, Christian, Roman relations. Because that's fascinated me, that sort of three-sided thing, how Jews saw Christians, Christians saw Jews, Romans saw both of them, and how they all placed themselves in that world. That's kind of I guess you could say, my framing issue question. And then more recently, when I came to the Netherlands, they have a completely different system here. It's a little bit kind of authoritarian. It's not that much collegial self-governance. You just arrive, and well, at least in my faculty, they just kind of tell you, you're going to be teaching in these 10 courses, 3 weeks in this one, 2 weeks in that one. It's very much shared courses by committee. So I've taught Dead Sea Scrolls, not very well probably, but I taught it historical method. I very much like questions of historical method, the philosophy of history, things like that. So I've got to indulge those interests, but also they kept me away from Christian origins, I think, ever since I've been here. I think maybe my approaches are not that welcome. I don't know. Though we have other people teaching Christian origins, so it doesn't matter that much. Whereas in Aberdeen, I focused on Christian origins, and I was the professor of Christian origins, so I had to develop new curriculum in that area. I didn't want to lean on my colleagues to teach new courses, but we needed a curricular expansion. So I added a Founders of Christianity course, a kind of general introduction to the earliest Christians. Really, that's the most fun to teach that course, because students have an investment, even if they don't really know much about it. They've heard some stuff, so one way or another, they're kind of interested, which is, half the battle of teaching is motivation, right?
Yep. So
that's quite fun. It's the most kind of electricity in the air that I've ever felt is teaching that course. And you're just looking at the text, in front of you. So that, and then I introduced a historical Jesus course as a kind of capstone to the 4-year Scottish degree. And I taught a course that I introduced on Jerusalem, history of Jerusalem, right through, through the Ottoman period until the First World War, from ancient times, which was nice as a window for students of all disciplines into world history, because Jerusalem's been, at the center, well, arguably in medieval maps, it's like the center of the world, the navel of the earth. It has been important. And you can view all of world history in some sense, great powers and so on, through Jerusalem's history. So that's quite fun to teach that course.
That's awesome. I would love to sat in on some of those. Do you?
Then I can add a couple of others.
Yeah,
In order
please.
to teach my own courses here, I went to other faculties and I offered a course on toleration and diversity in modern Europe. Or, how's it called? Yeah, tolerating diversity in modern Europe. So way out of my field, but they allowed me to do it, so I did it. But it was about Jews and Christians and others, but skipping over the Roman period very quickly into the medieval and especially modern post-Enlightenment periods. So the rise of fascism and Nazism and all of that. Also enormously challenging and interesting to teach, as you can imagine.
Yeah, yeah, very pertinent to what's going on in the world today.
Yes, yeah.
Um, I noticed you did at least 2 TEDx talks. Just a quick question: did you enjoy that? Do you enjoy doing those kind of presentations?
Yeah, actually only did one TEDx talk. I've done others, but the only one was a TEDx talk. And I enjoyed them very much when you're in the moment.
Yeah.
The only thing with those is, as people may know, some of your viewers may know, they take a lot of preparation. I like to speak, without notes. That's how I was trained in a Bible college. In fact, that's where I received my first training as a speaker. And whether it's any good or not, I don't know, but I enjoy doing it. I mean, in other words, they prefer not to read text. And the TEDx format requires that. But because of that, you're assigned a coach, and they require you basically to memorize the thing, and you go over it, at least in our neck of the woods. That's how it works. So then you arrive in this big theater, packed theater, and it's quite ego boosting, to see all these people. Of course, they're not there for you, they're there for the whole day's events, and that your talk is quite compressed. Nevertheless, it's a rush to do it. It's quite fun, yeah. The only problem is it's social, unlike our interview today, that you have to say things in a very pithy way that you can't really defend. So you can attract much criticism without having articulated what you really meant to say. But
Yeah, I could see that being a little frustrating.
still, it's a great honor to do it, and it's huge fun. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I hope you get to do more of that. Well, I wanted to ask next just about your story, specifically maybe just to give a brief background of your, where you grew up and what that was like, specifically the religious side of, your parents, your upbringing, and then what the high points were between your childhood and where you are today.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm getting old, so there's a little bit to tell, but I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. My dad was born in India, lived his first 17 years there, child of British Army family, came back to Britain, married my mother from Sheffield in England. They moved to Canada. They had my sister born there, but then they moved to Canada shortly after that, at a time in the 50s when there was still rationing in Britain. And a lot of Brits were moving to either Australia or Canada. They went to Canada first, and I was born there shortly after, 3 or 4 years later. Then about 12 years after they moved to Canada, they thought the better option was Australia. And then we had now 5 children in the family, but my father, rather undaunted, I guess because of his own traveling background and rootlessness, didn't mind taking us all back to Britain to qualify for this 10-pound Tommy trip to Australia. So we all got on an immigrant ship to Australia, headed into the Mediterranean. We're supposed to go through the Suez Canal, but the 6-day war broke out, and so we turned around and went back around South Africa and had a month on board ship, which for a 9-year-old boy was like, my love of ships began at that time. Got to Australia. I lived there for just over 6 years in Sydney and Melbourne. Then my dad decided it was time to go back to Canada after all. That was a better place to be. So we went back to Britain for a few months and then back to Canada. So Britain was always the middle term. Back to Canada. So my family was, when they were in Canada, when my parents moved to Canada, they had converted to Pentecostalism. So they'd been raised British Christian, Anglican-ish, but didn't feel any particular, Christian commitment. But this staying with the family in a basement apartment with a family that was Pentecostal, they got into this, converted, were baptized, and then I was born into that and was dedicated as a little Pentecostal boy. So I grew up with that, except in Australia, they kind of moved away from that because there weren't churches around, so we were sort of Baptists there. But back in Canada, we were Pentecostals again. In the process, I was going to either go in the Navy, I loved ships, or become a Pentecostal minister, which might seem like an odd choice, but to me it made all the sense in the world. I had a sense of duty and honor that was drilled into me in my Australian boyhood. My teacher and principal was a very kind of military guy. I was in Army cadets and all of that. So for me, this sense of honor or duty or doing something important in the world and giving back, doing something selfless, doing something for the greater good, was the thing to do. So it was either naval officer or a Pentecostal minister, strangely enough. My dad said no to the Navy because he knew I wanted to join the Australian Navy and was just about old enough to go to officer training college, but he knew we were leaving, so he said no. And we went back to Canada. Then I decided to go to Bible college after high school. And I did, and I was valedictorian in the Pentecostal Bible College. And also most likely to succeed in the ministry, which is I think a death knell vote that they take every year, because most people who get this award leave the church after a while, so quite strangely. After that, I had some run-ins with the Pentecostal leadership. I graduated, but I couldn't get credentials from them, which you need to be in ministry, because I had some differences with them. So I decided to go to university and make the most of what I had. There was one university, McMaster, one credible university, that gave some credit for your 3 years in Bible college. I'm not sure if they regret that or not now, but they did at the time. So it seemed the best thing to do to get a year up going there, and I did. But I stumbled into this amazing place where they taught Judaism and Christianity together, and they had teachers like E.P. Sanders and Al Baumgarten and Alan Mendelsohn and Alan Cooper in Hebrew Bible and Gerard Vallée in early Christianity, all these great scholars, Ben Meyer in early Christianity as well. And I was just blown away. Like after Bible college, we had some not bad teachers in Bible college, especially in church history and a couple other subjects like preaching and ethics. They knew their stuff. But New Testament was sort of taught by pastors, because it was a dangerous field for critical thinking. So university, wow, it just blew me away. It was like, this is the most fun in the world to investigate these texts, learn Greek, learn Hebrew, actually read the text carefully at a low level initially, but it was so exciting. And then I had so many questions and problems arising from my background that basically propelled me through my doctorate, just trying to figure out stuff about the Roman world, the context of early Christianity, relationship with Judaism, all this stuff which had been quite garbled and cloudy in my brain. I just wanted to get some answers that would satisfy me. Sorry, Tim.
So they were going to textual criticism at that time?
Yeah, by textual criticism, that's a technical term, right? Meaning the manuscript criticism. So the kind of stuff that Bart Ehrman does in some of his work. Larry Hurtado was big into that. Looking at the manuscripts. So textual criticism is, this technical term. Sometimes I say that because sometimes people outside the field don't really know that. It sounds just like criticism of the text.
Right.
But actually, textual criticism means trying to figure out which manuscript readings are the best ones.
Sure.
But yeah, all the other kinds of historical criticism, but which is not a negative thing. Not criticizing in the sense of, I found a fault with you. It's having a critical frame of mind. That is an analytical frame of mind, asking questions, saying, what's going on here?
Yeah, and just to put a pin in the map of your journey, as you went into this college, you were, as far as I'm understanding from your story, you were a believer in Jesus as your savior. Is that correct?
Yeah. When I went in, that's true. Yeah, very much so. And I'd done some sort of quasi missionary work working in Northern Ontario, teaching. These groups were already Christian. They were fervent Pentecostals up in Canadian Indian reserves, Native Canadian First Nations, now Indian reserves, as we called them then. Went up on sort of teaching missions for half a summer. So yeah, I was very much into it. And university wasn't like, the problem is in the church, people thought they really had this idea: go to university, you're going to lose your faith. That's probably true, but not for the reasons that they thought. They think of it as you go there and sit there and somebody tells you stuff and you say, oh, wow, and then you become a sheep and you say, yeah, I believe what this guy said. So this person has perverted you, taken you away from the truth. But it's not like that at all, at least for a thoughtful person. And I think most people who go to university are thoughtful people. It's rather that you just start thinking for yourself. And they're not trying to tell you what to believe. Ben Meyer, one of my teachers, I'm quite sure he was a very committed Christian, but he was an ex-Jesuit who had laicized and married, and so on. But he had an incredible training, extremely knowledgeable. And E.P. Sanders was an ordained minister in the church, liberal Protestant kind of guy. So it wasn't that it was a home for unbelievers, actually, not at all. But these people just taught you to think about the text and to say, what's going on here? And as you did that, you started to conceive questions you never had before. So for me, it was a two-sided thing that was my undoing, but also wonderful. My undoing was, on the one hand, we had to take a minor in Eastern religious traditions. And so I studied in my BA classical Hinduism, or as we call it, Indian traditions, Hinduism being a kind of Christian formulation. It's been accepted later in later Indian traditions, but anyway, classical Indian traditions and classical Chinese traditions in my MA. And what I began to think was, in church teaching, all these people had simply been living in darkness and polytheism and so on. And it was not a good situation for them unless they followed Christ. But when you just began to see for yourself, and you had to actually write essays, and you had to think something responsible about these quite beautiful texts, Taoist texts and classical Hindu texts about the Brahman and the life and death, and it's just beautiful stuff, And then you began to think to yourself, wait a minute, I need a lot of understanding here that I don't have. So that's one thing. And then on the other side, actually studying the early Christian text from a completely different perspective in a historical framework, you began to say, wow, this is so much more interesting than the sort of systematic theological approach, which was the doctrine of sin, the doctrine of a man, and theological anthropology, ecclesiology, by putting everything under a sort of subject heading, rather than actually understanding Paul's letter to the Thessalonians.
Yeah. That was more along the lines of probably what I got as well. My Bible college experience was more systematic theology and preparation for ministry. Could I ask, when as you're sharing some of that, I was wondering, if I'm hearing it correctly, were there some things that came up, especially as you studied the early Christian writings? And I'm assuming when you say that, you mean not just the canonical ones, but the non-canonical books. Yeah. As you discover this and you discover more and more, was there any kind of shock or cracks that were coming at that point where you're saying, no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. It's just the idea of the foundations, that there's something. Number one, there's some stuff that I haven't been told before, and I kind of wish I'd been told this, and kind of shocked I haven't heard this before. But number two, this has implications, and I need to figure out, validate this stuff and figure out what are the implications of what I'm learning.
Yeah, this is exactly it. The only qualification I'd make is it's not what I was told. The way of teaching at McMaster, which was, I think it's still followed today, I hope so, by different people, is that it's very much text-centered. So pull out the text. Let's read this. What does it say? What does it mean? And that was true not only for the early Christian texts, but also the Hindu and Chinese texts. You know, you read the text, and then you figure out what's the historical context, what do these words mean, you know, what's being translated here. And of course, as you get into graduate school, you switch into the original languages for those questions. So that's what it was. It was really wrestling for myself. Nobody was telling me stuff, really. And I knew that my professors disagreed with each other quite a bit on, you know, interpretation. Sanders and Meyer disagreed, even in print sometimes, over some issues. So it wasn't that. It wasn't being told, but it was definitely what the crack was. I think, you know, I'd grown up with this idea of biblical inerrancy, and that's an odd idea when, you know, no matter how you think about it, it's pretty odd. But at the time, I figured, well, smarter people than I have sorted all this stuff out, you know, because I'd read a bunch of smart people in the evangelical world, you know, John Stott and guys like that, who, you know, they're not dummies. So they had very sophisticated ways of explaining, well, you know, it's like the original text, you know, which we don't have, is inerrant. But of course, the different manuscripts aren't inerrant, and then the translations are not inerrant. But well, what is inerrant then? Anyway, this whole concept, once you began to look at things in their historical environment, and you see Paul as a real person, you know, getting angry and saying, well, even if to other people I'm not an apostle, I should be to you, because come on, where's your love? You know, I established you as a group, and you're turning your backs on me. And you see this very human kind of interaction, and you say to yourself, these are like, it's a category confusion, you know, like what's inerrancy got to do with this? So it's a wonderful text, it's fascinating, but what does inerrancy add to it? You know, what? So I remember I went to see a guy, I'm not going to name him because he's passed away now, but, you know, I don't know how his legacy would be about this, but he was in another part of campus. He was teaching the divinity school down the road. And he was known for having written a book on biblical inerrancy. So people can probably figure out who it is if they really want.
You mean defending it?
Yeah. And he was a famous, you know, evangelical guy. It was at the Baptist college down the road.
Okay.
So I went to talk to him one day and said, look, I've been doing all this stuff. I was only in my first year there. And I'm saying, I really have, I don't know what to make of all this. And he said, yeah. He said, well, I don't really believe that anymore.
Like he didn't believe his own book?
He didn't believe it anymore either, yeah. So
wow.
he'd come to have a different view of things so it was kind of in his juvenilia, you know, that he'd written about biblical inerrancy, but he'd moved on. He still valued the authority of the Bible very much.
Right.
So he's still a committed Christian, but he couldn't talk anymore about inerrancy.
Yeah.
So anyway, then I thought, okay, well, all right, so much for that. But then that was only the first kind of wall to go down. Then the rest of it was really just, it wasn't so much challenging each element of the creed as just having a different way of seeing everything that was much more real, you know, much more satisfying, made much more sense. And one could have some kind of faith. I mean, you know, I've been very close to people in my life who had a kind of faith related to these texts, but still saw them in their historical way. So, for example, one person I know I was very close to, a woman said, well, I see these as kind of, it's like a family photo album, you know, and this is what people did 2,000 years ago. And we don't try to be like them today. I mean, it's like, you know, when you see your relatives from the 19th century, you say, well, that's weird, how they dressed, how they did stuff, what they thought even. But yeah, it's part of the lineage. I found that a kind of a charming way to approach things. It's not to say the way I'd grown up, and possibly you, or been educated, as it's all static, it's all revelation, it's all this, it's a fixed kind of body. To see a developmental idea creeping in.
Well, can I ask,
kind of neat. Yeah.
just to clarify and maybe to if we call our North Star here, the goal of our eventual conversation is to get to the historical origins of Christianity subject,
Yeah,
but to start with
yeah,
a baseline first. I guess this is for me, this is for our viewers. I want to understand, I guess, just to put it this way, number one, I want to ask what you believe currently, and then I want to ask for a little bit of a story of at what point was there ever, I know that it sounds like it was a slow transition, but at what
yeah,
point was there ever a point at which you realized, I don't believe X anymore?
yeah,
And to talk about that, like for example, for me, this is not about my story, so I won't go into more detail than this, but just for me, it was an hour. It was about literally a year ago exactly. I had been thinking about things for at least a year, maybe 2 years, starting with issues of genocide, dealing with the issues of the discrepancies in the Bible. I got exposed very, very heavily to the idea of the Bible being man-made, and eventually, as you know, dealing with genocide, slavery, misogyny, land theft, racism, all these issues, genital mutilation, you begin to think, this sounds like this is like a psychopathic tribal warfare god. What am I into? And it kind of shakes you up, and eventually you start dealing with the discrepancies in the Bible. You realize, you know, this sounds just like a mystery cult from the Greco-Roman era. This sounds, you know, all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, I've been discovering that the New Testament is copying and based in part on the structure and borrowing from, you know, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Euripides, the Bacchae, Second Maccabees, and you're like, wait a second. And, you know, find out Pythagoras is in the New Testament behind the scenes, and it's like, okay, something's wrong here. And at a certain point, literally in an hour, it just hit me like someone opened up the floodgates, and it was in my face, and I was like, shoot, this isn't real. Shoot, this has never been real.
wow.
Shoot, there's no God. Shoot, there's no eternity. There's no heaven. There's no hell. Like, oh my goodness. And it literally felt like in the Matrix when, you know, when Neo gets the metal thing shoved in his head and they're teaching him jujitsu in 10 seconds. It's like, whoa, this is awesome, because I feel like I just escaped from a prison, but it's also overwhelming. And I guess I wanted to ask if you had anything parallel to that, and if you did, we know what it was like. But maybe
Yeah.
starting with, just so we know where it's headed, or you do whatever order you want. But, you know, where are you now with that? Meaning, is there a God named Yahweh? Does he have a son? And is he the savior of the world?
So these videos are your jujitsu that you got poured into a year ago. That's really fresh for you. I'm going to start with the moment. Yeah, the moment. There was a moment, except there was a long buildup. So it was a long time. You know, here's the problem, Tim. For me, it was a matter of cognitive dissonance. I've come to learn that it should possibly be called. I'm not sure I have that right. I have to talk with my daughter about it more. Psychiatric nurse. But anyway, I think that's right. It was, you know, trying to hold two incompatible things in your being. I don't know if it's in my brain or not, but anyway, somehow in myself. So I was married to the daughter of one wonderful person. Still, we're divorced now. Still a wonderful person. The daughter of Pentecostal missionaries, and I was trying very much to humor her parents and her and everybody, and still went to a Pentecostal church. Just sat there, kind of, you know, cut off from it all. And it was one Sunday evening that I was driving to church, and I just got halfway there, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I mean, in the Paul Simon's words, I think I had a little bit of a breakdown. At that moment, I just can't go. You know, I can't go. I can't sit there anymore and do this thing. So I went home, and I thought I was kind of ill or something like that, and I guess I was ill, but I was okay. I could still function. But I realized then that I really had to be more honest with myself. I was honest with myself internally, but I had to be more fully honest, more, you know, in Greek they have a word parousia, frank speech, being open about being able to say everything that's inside. Today we call it, you know, like therapy of some kind. But I needed to do that, and so I shopped around for another kind of church, one that wasn't so, such a hothouse, and such a family, a little bit more open, more liberal. I went to a German Baptist church for a while to work on my German, dragged my wife out there, dragged her to some more liberal Protestant places, which were fine, but they didn't believe anything at all. So then the question was, well, why bother going there? It's more like a social group, but they're not your friends. So, what's the point of that? So I drifted away, and then she kept going to church, and eventually we divorced, unfortunately, because she's a wonderful person.
When you were going to those churches, were you truly looking for a church that fit and trying to salvage the God concept, or were you already
a little bit? I'm not a mythicist, and I'll come to that in a moment. And I never have been. I was a kind of, I think I ended up, so what I ended up with was this. After I had this kind of breakdown, and I realized everything's just blown to hell now, of what I've grown up with, I began a process, and it was incredibly painful, and it lasted a few years in my 20s, of trying to rebuild from nothing. It's a little bit, to put a very fancy label, it's a little bit like Descartes, and some of your listeners will know about, his, what can I build on? He ends up with, I think, therefore I am, as a kind, do I exist even, as a foundation. I went through on a very much lower level and much more ignorant level, something like that, of saying, where can I start? Where's a starting point for me that I can grab onto? And I didn't start with God, that's for sure. I just started with existence, like, what is this life about, really? And I didn't come up with a lot of firm answers, but I gradually began to build out, okay, well, I find myself here, and what works, what makes sense, and build out from that. And I ended up, I think, with a kind of what I would have described as ethical monotheism. That is to say, without knowing anything about a God, nevertheless, there's order. So now I'm going to come to the other issue. What do I believe as a result of this? I would separate completely the questions of the history of Christian origins and what you believe about God or not God. That is to say, Christian origins could be a total fabrication by somebody in his living room somewhere in Corinth or someplace. And yet, the question of God is a separate issue. For Plato, for Pythagoras, for the Stoics, these questions operated entirely separately from, and for Jews, Muslims, entirely separately from the question of early Christianity. Voltaire, you mentioned him in your introduction. He has a nice thing on his philosophical dictionary at the end of the article on atheism. He has a nice statement which links up with Tom Paine at the beginning of his Age of Reason. Both of these guys, and Thomas Jefferson, too. There's a bunch of people in this frame of mind. They're savage critics of traditional Christian teaching, the incarnation, the resurrection, the biblical stories, Jonah and the whale. They regard it all as superstition, as fanaticism, as ridiculous, unbelievable, unworthy of a thoughtful person. But what Voltaire says at the end of his article on atheism is, most people package this together because they've been trained in it. And so when they come to disbelieve it, they say, well, that's it. I don't, that's the version of God that I know. I throw it out, it's ridiculous. So now I don't believe in God. And Voltaire says that's not the right response. The right response is, okay, I throw all that out because it's ridiculous. Now, what do I think about God? That's a separate issue. And for him, it's not, he doesn't get into like, Thomas Aquinas or Anselm's arguments, ontological arguments, and whatnot. And I'm with him there. Like, I don't think you can solve anything with these arguments. And I don't think anybody knows. My view is this, in a nutshell, that I know some of my limitations. I think most of us have the same limitation. We are not geared. We can't even comprehend infinity, right? I mean, we know what it is. We can draw it, but we don't know. We can't get our heads around it because we think there's an end to things, and we think, we have limitations. So we can't really pronounce on ultimate questions that we don't know about. And that includes scientists, historians, whatever. There are limited things we can talk about. Our disciplines allow us to investigate. Ultimate questions we can think about, but, and may even be fun at times to think about them. We can debate them, but we're not going to reach ultimate answers about them, I think. So the ancients already knew this. The ancients knew this, and they took a pragmatic approach. So if you read, Socrates, Plato's Apology of Socrates, or Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, these guys, even though they're kind of committed to a view, sort of, roughly, while they live, when it comes down to it, what happens, like when you die, they say, I don't know. Maybe it's atoms, maybe it's just atoms, or maybe there's something there. Maybe the soul in some way continues. Either way, not so bad when we die. So that issue of a god or not a god, I mean, it of course depends what you mean by God. If you think of in Eastern traditions, like here's what you asked me what I believe. I don't think belief is really that much of a thing. I mean, there's no point arguing about beliefs. What I mean is, it's all about how you're going to live your life. Do you live as if there's a meaning in life that you did not create? Or do you live as if there's meaning that is there whether you create it or not? So like the properties of, to take I think one of the clearest examples from Pythagoras and Plato, take the properties of circles or cubes or triangles. We discover these things, I think. I mean, we don't invent them. There are things we invent, we construct, but these are not constructed. And much of science, I think most of science is about, in spite of a group of humanities scholars who argue that all science is constructed as well, or they seem to argue that, it's really discovered. I mean, what we're trying to do is figure out what is, right? What works. The fact that we can have this conversation, the fact that you have invited me to talk in a way that will resonate or not resonate with others in the way of arguments and discussion back and forth means that there's something beyond you and me. Like if we were just atoms floating around and in an arbitrary way, we couldn't do that. I mean, there's something reasonable. This is Stoics thought that we all had a spark, of the same spark of reason, logos, nature, God. They called that God, but all they meant by God was, the animating principle of nature. And this is somewhat like Benedict about Spinoza. And I believe that, I heard that Einstein once asked about his view of God. So, well, I believe in Spinoza's God. Meaning, I think there's nature. But this doesn't mean we know stuff. It doesn't mean we've got things figured out. It just means, how are you going to live your life? Are you going to live as if everything's arbitrary and it's all atoms and it's all random? Or are you going to live, what works best for learning, for ordered society? Voltaire said, I'll tell you what, if I'm signing a contract with somebody, I'd much rather this person was a theist than an atheist. Meaning, simply that forget about ultimate questions that we can't answer, but does this person believe that there's actually something in ethical responsibility that is beyond what that person feels at any moment? If I'm signing a contract with him, I sure want him to think that there's something bigger for him, some meaning that he's committed to, some obligation. Now, of course, Dogmatic atheists can also explain this by the principle of altruism and so on. But I think there's much more to it than that. There is the worlds that we actually live in, it seems to me, works best if people think that reason is not something that they can just play with. It exists. I mean, I couldn't do my job. I wouldn't publish anything if I really thought all my thoughts were just my own thoughts and everyone's were their own thoughts, and we couldn't reason together. So, you know, there's Noam Chomsky's stuff about are we hardwired for language and for linguistic explanation, things like that. These kind of questions, to me, favor the idea. I'm not that thrilled about the word God because it's so misleading. You asked me about whether Jesus was God's son and all that. Well, there I think historical stuff comes into play, in trying to understand what these terms even mean. But no, I mean, as a matter of philosophy, how I live my life, no. I'm much more interested. I find much more valuable ancient Stoics on the Greek side, and I think some beautiful stuff in the Eastern traditions about the Tao. But the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. The Lao Tzu says the first couple of lines. So, and it's the same in Judaism. Philo of Alexandria said, yeah, we have to think there's an order in nature, but if you try to describe God, you're really screwed, because forget about it. I mean, and that's one of the great things about Judaism. It's actually taken in this way. It says you can't say anything about God. As soon as you start talking, this is the idea of making an image of God, that's forbidden. You ought not to do that because it's above your pay grade, like just be happy with the moral order and do your best with that.
Would you
so
say
that's a bit of a long answer, but that's kind of where, does that kind of make a little bit of sense?
Yeah, it's good. It's different than how I would answer it, but it's good. I've got a friend who he was actually part of my long story of deconversion, a retired gentleman who I knew from way back at a different job in Philadelphia. And I met him right before he retired from the company. And he and his wife invited me out a lot. They do a lot of greyhound rescue for the dogs, and they would invite me to come help with those events. And at one point, I got to talk to him because I knew he went to church. And as we started talking about some of these kinds of issues, I could tell that almost every answer that I was looking for a black and white answer on, he would give it's a gray area. And he would even challenge me sometimes. He would say, you're thinking about it too black and white, it's gray. And I would think about it and I would come up with what I thought was a gray answer. And I would describe it to him and he'd say, no, that's still black and white. So he kept on challenging me to think about it. And I will admit, when you're used to being a literal fundamentalist Christian, it's, there is one God. His name is Yahweh. He is absolutely as real as can be, and he's he's the origin of everything and the judge of all. Answers that are anywhere near nebulous, even a little bit, sound basically heretical to someone who came from that. So I'm used to that. It's crystal clear, but it's good. I mean, it's good to be challenged to think through these things. I think though I do find some value in. Like there's a gentleman that you may have heard of before. I'm not sure if you follow too many atheist podcasts, whatever, but there's a gentleman named Pine Creek Doug, and he goes through this speed list where he says, I want a quick answer. I want yes or no, yes or no. Was Paul the author of all of his epistles, or what? Did Jesus actually exist or not? All these things, and he just wants a quick yes or no. And I think there's a part of me that tends to want that. And I understand that that's not necessarily the best way to do every answer, that there's more nuance. But I get the sense of where you're coming from. And I do want to ask, this is a clarification. It sounds like you might be the kind of person that doesn't favor the word atheist, that you would either prefer the word agnostic or just not to have any of that kind of terminology at all. Is that fair to say?
I don't mind the word atheist. I think it's misused a lot and it's confusing. Can I give you an example?
Please.
I've always enjoyed listening to both of the Hitchens brothers, the late Christopher and his brother Peter, very, very different characters in their polemical aims, of course. And I think Christopher, I hope Peter wouldn't mind my saying this, I think he's in a certain way, the more skilled debater. Um, but I was in a lecture series in Toronto where Christopher Hitchens, I mean, I was way below him on the pecking order, but he was the star. He gave the inaugural lecture in this. It was actually the Dead Sea Scrolls were being exhibited at the Royal Ontario Museum. And so they had a lecture series on stuff related to the Bible, basically. And Hitchens, the strange thing was that with Dawkins and a couple of others, he was like this, he was like the emblem of the new atheism. And yet in his lecture, he was essentially promoting The Age of Reason by Tom Paine.
Right.
And this is a book I've used in teaching that I absolutely love. I mean, I think Tom Paine, in spite of having some sympathies with his opponent, Edmund Burke, on the French Revolution, I think that Paine was just a genius, like in his life story. You want a story, I mean, that guy's story is unbelievable. But Paine begins by saying, writing just after the French Revolution, when he's headed for probably death in prison, he thinks, for favoring, opposing the radical revolutionaries. He writes at the beginning, he said, look, I have to write this. And I thought it would be the last thing I would write, my views on religion. But I have to write it because after the French Revolution, when quite rightly, all this superstition, priestcraft, churchy stuff, domination of people's minds is all been eradicated. Good. Problem. What I don't want to happen is humanity, morality, and the true theology to be thrown out with the bath, the baby with the bathwater. And that's what his title is, the Age of Reason, or the true versus the fabulous, not in the way we use fabulous, but fabelhaft, like fable-ridden theology. He says, if you want to think about God, look at nature, and science should be theology, right? Science is the study of nature. That's what we should all be doing, not, Greek and Latin texts and getting all arguing about virgin birth or whatever. Forget about it, live a happy life and study nature. And he quotes one of the Psalms, Psalm 19 is like, you can see God's work in his creation. That's all he's interested in. And he's got nothing to say about God except the principle of nature that needs now to be studied. Voltaire, very similarly, on his, I don't know if I can or should share my screen with you, but
You're welcome to.
Happen to have a photograph which I sent myself an email from a couple of years ago when I visited the Pantheon in Paris. And I took a photograph, which I'll try to bring up here, of Voltaire's tomb. That's what I'm trying to get to here. So screen share. Am I allowed to share this screen?
I think it will let you.
Can you see that?
Oh, well, yeah.
So it says, he fought against the atheists and the fanatics, right? He fought against the atheists and the fanatics, and he inspired tolerance and reclaimed the rights of man. So this is an amazing thing, right? So I'll stop sharing there. That he was, and if you read his articles in the Philosophical Dictionary on atheism, he's adamantly opposed. But he says, if between the two of them, fanaticism, religious fanaticism, and atheism, religious fanaticism is far more dangerous, far more awful, far more repulsive. Atheists, basically don't go around killing each other generally. Although, with some exceptions. I mean, the 20th century regimes that have been explicitly atheist have done most of the killing in tens of millions, right? Both the Soviet and Chinese and the killing fields, and all of these were explicitly atheist regimes. So that was long after Voltaire said that atheists don't hurt each other or don't hurt other people. I'm not sure that works at all. So anyway, what the bottom line is for me that I think, here was Hitchens promoting Tom Paine, and he did it again. I saw him in a debate with his brother, and he put Tom Paine up there as his first kind of example of a real critical thinker about early Christianity. I think he's dead right. And Voltaire and Jefferson, actually, no, not so many people know about Jefferson because he tried to keep it hidden, but for his political reasons. But he was a deist, like these guys were, and saw nature as the real object of should be the object of our attention and science. And so when he founded the University of Virginia, he would not allow the teaching of theology in the University of Virginia because science was the thing. But this was the study of God's creation. Right. So he said, I'm a Christian in the only sense in which Jesus of Nazareth wanted anyone to be his follower, which was to say he has the finest precepts of anybody, So he said, if that's what it means to follow the actual guy, Jesus, I'm a Christian, and I'm as good a Christian as any, because he was already being accused of being a closet, atheist. Mm-hmm. He says, I'm not an atheist at all. I follow Christ, and I revere God. What I reject is all the mythology that the followers of Christ have put on him, the virgin birth, the physical resurrection, all that stuff. To say, blood atonement on the cross and things like that. And these are, ruthlessly attacked by Tom Paine. The idea of substitutionary atonement, he says that's just grossly immoral. You can't tell that to a child because it's like offensive, the idea of somebody dying for somebody else.
Yeah. Especially when it's mixed with blood magic and scapegoating
and all of that. Yeah, but that didn't make him an atheist for sure. And he wrote his book against atheism, and just as Voltaire was, you could see on his inscription there, fighting against the atheists.
So he wasn't an atheist, even though probably a lot of Christians would have effectively called him, if not an atheist, at least a heretic or someone that was not a Christian.
Well, this is the amazing thing. After he wrote this book explicitly against rejecting atheism, he was known and ended his life in poverty and disgrace when he returned to the U.S. as an atheist. And for that reason, he was abominated socially. Later on, Teddy Roosevelt, the American president, called him famously that filthy little atheist, Thomas Paine. I mean, he played such a role in the American Revolution. It's unbelievable. But he died in poverty and hated by much of his own country for being allegedly an atheist. So if my reluctance to use the term arises just from a lot of fuzziness about what it means, and there's a classical scholar who's written a book recently called Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World, something to that effect. And again, here there's a certain slippage in what you mean by atheism. Christians were called atheists, Jews were called atheists in the ancient world sometimes.
Yeah.
It was why? Because they didn't accept the gods, prevailing gods, doing the duties that were expected of a member of a polis, a city, for the gods. Yeah.
Being monotheist versus polytheistic.
Yeah, and some philosophers have said that monotheism is effectively atheism.
Yeah.
For the reasons I was saying, if you look at Philo and Josephus, these two major Jewish writers from the first century, both of them say, they reject Josephus, this guy you mentioned that I work on quite a bit. In his introduction to the Antiquities, said, Moses rejects these unseemly tales about the gods doing stuff. He directs our attention upward to nature and to infer the nature of God from nature. So this is very much like the deists, Yeah.
It's interesting.
So for that reason, they sound like atheists.
Yeah, and it's funny too. Just a quick side comment about people who believe in God, like the ancient Jews, being called atheists. The quote, I'm sure you've seen it from Ricky Gervais, where he talks about if for example there were 4,000 gods that have ever been created, he's like, you don't believe in 3,999 of them. I just add one more to the list. But suddenly, because I add the one more to the list, I'm the bad guy. But
yeah, well, this was exactly Julian the Emperor's critique of the Jews, especially, but secondarily the Christians. Of the Jews, he said, here's the world, like the Greek view of the world, every people with its God, its culture, its place, live and let live, pluralism, it's good. He said, you Jews are just like the rest of us in every other way.
Yeah.
You have your place, you have your temple, you did have your temple. Julian tried to restore it, actually. Your worship. The problem with you is that you think your God is the only God. Why can't you be a little bit more humble and just accept that it's one sectional God? But of course, from the Jewish point of view, if you have quite good thinkers like Philo was, and many Greek Jewish writings, a number of Greek Jewish writings, deal with this problem by saying, no, it's just our name for it. It's the God you call Zeus. It's the God you call ultimate, reality. That's what we call, by our name.
And it's fascinating how often that happens, where someone, a Greek god gets renamed in the Greek mythology or whatever.
Yeah.
I do want to ask. I want to at some point soon get to some of the other questions focused more on origins of Christianity. But if you're okay, if I dive into this a little bit more, I'd like to just dive into the issue of kind of what we're talking about historically speaking, but to bring it into current experience with people today. And I know we talked about this a little bit offline, but the idea that when you grow up as a Christian, and I admittedly was not Pentecostal at all, and I had no exposure to it apart from maybe reading a little bit about it. But
you don't know what you were missing.
I apparently don't. I understand they were much more charismatic. That's about, if you said, what do they believe? I would say, I think they're much more charismatic. That's about all I could say, which is, to my fault for not knowing more. But if you grew up in the environment under any denomination that says Jesus is God's son, he's the savior of the world, you are destined for eternal punishment unless you have him covering you. And you get the sense that every other religion is very deficient. You grow up with God as, Yahweh is God, the Bible is book, Jesus is his son, the gospel is what it's all about. And whether or not you address, if or when you ever address whether or not that's true or if it's mythology, as you're hearing that story, you're still hearing everything else being discounted. Buddhism might have some good things, but it's wrong. Same thing for Islam, every other religion. It's all wrong. And they would focus a lot on the gloriousness of the idea of grace. In other words, you could look at all these religions, and I've heard Robert Price talk about how there's actually a branch, I think, of Buddhism that's very similar to the idea of God's grace. But most religions, by and large, are not focused on grace. It's more like I do something, I bring enough of an offering to God, I do something good, I say enough prayers. That it's either faith plus works, the traditional Roman Catholic perspective, or it's very much full works. And the idea of this is just free grace. You don't deserve anything. The only thing you bring to it is perhaps the willingness to admit you're completely depraved and in need of grace. You bow your knee and you can repent of your sins, but you don't, even that is a gift from God. For Ephesians 2:8-9, everything, even the faith to say, God, I need you, please redeem me. Even that, it feels like it's you doing it, but even that is God preemptively working in your heart, and especially from a Calvinistic perspective, which is what I came from.
Okay.
But when you grow up with this, the gloriousness of the gospel, the gloriousness of grace, the utter deficiencies of all the other religions, when you have that as your structure, as your absolute foundation, your worldview, and that falls apart, there is the implication, not saying this is rational or logical, but just there's the implication for people who have that if this was the top tier, everything else is so far lower, that the path from that to atheism does feel fairly clear in the sense of, like when I deconverted, I had absolutely no interest whatsoever in saying, well, I've just debunked Christianity. Maybe Islam's right, maybe Buddhism's got the path. It was an instant, like I couldn't go back to anything. And it's funny, I talk a lot with people about why is Christianity mythology? Why is it not literally true? Yeah. And as much as, like, if someone could theoretically debunk it and say, well, what you saw in John 21 is those, you know, a rewrite of Pythagoras, you know, with the 153 fish, or what you saw is a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey in Luke and Acts. We can debunk that and show you that's not true. And if they could theoretically start to just take every single step that I've taken and say, I can prove to you it's not what you thought it was, like there's something that happens in your head, at least in my head, that says, I feel so incredibly duped that no matter what you tell me at this point, and I know we don't ever say never, but it just feels like there's something mythological that you get disgusted by and you feel duped by, and you say, I couldn't go back to that no matter what you say. Not that I don't want to pursue the truth. I will pursue the truth, but I'm so disgusted by that. I know that's not true. I want truth, but I know that's not it. Yahweh's not God. There might be a God, but it's not Yahweh.
Yeah.
And so for me, the path from deconversion to atheism was, you know, a quarter of an inch long. It just, bam, if there's no if there's no Yahweh and there's no Jesus, there's no God. And I know you've addressed that as saying that's not necessarily the healthiest way to see it. And I just wanted to ask you to briefly kind of respond to that. And if you know, if we were friends that chatted every week and we were kind of talking through, you know, if you had been part of my conversation at that point, what would you have added to the conversation to say, yeah, but there's more to that?